There is a quiet kind of mystery hiding in the forests of the past, a mystery whispered by old cabins whose walls have seen storms that could freeze breath into ice, yet somehow kept the people inside warm enough to sleep in comfort. And as the night falls softly across our own modern world, full of thermostats, furnaces, and technology, we begin to realize that something is strange, almost unsettling, about the way a simple medieval log cabin can survive a brutal winter night, with nothing more than a single fire glowing in the hearth, while modern houses, equipped with expensive heating systems and wrapped in layers of insulation, turn cold within hours the moment the power goes out. And as you close your eyes or settle deeper into your pillow, imagine the quiet stillness of a midnight landscape at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the sky shimmering with cold stars, the wind whispering through dark spruces, and inside a small cabin built almost 2 centuries ago, the air holding steady at a soft 68 degrees, warm enough for bare hands and warm enough for sleep, all sustained simply by the thermal memory of thick timbers and the gentle radiation of a stone heater that glows long after its fire has died. Tonight, in a slow and steady rhythm meant to guide you toward rest, we will travel back into that world and uncover why those medieval builders, with nothing but axes, patience, and instinct, crafted structures that could shelter human life in conditions that would quickly overwhelm the modern home. And we will let the answers unfold like a warm blanket of old knowledge, unhurried, detailed, and quietly astonishing. Walk into a modern home in the early hours of a winter morning, and you begin to feel, almost immediately, the tension between comfort and fragility, because every room depends on a constant hum of machinery, every degree of warmth depends on electricity and fuel, and every moment of silence from the furnace is the beginning of a slow but certain descent toward the cold outside, a descent so quick that researchers can measure it almost in real time, as the interior begins losing roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit every hour, even when the temperature outdoors is merely freezing. Move closer to a window, and you will feel the faint but unmistakable draft, a reminder that even with carefully installed insulation, vapor barriers, house wraps, and layers of modern materials, the average new house still leaks air in a way medieval builders would never have tolerated. And in fact, tests show that the combined gaps and seams of modern construction equal a hole almost 2 feet wide in the building envelope, meaning that every winter day your furnace is not heating your home but heating the outdoors. This dependency becomes dangerous when the power fails, because a modern house is built around the belief that heat must be constantly produced, constantly pumped, constantly delivered, and the moment that flow stops, whether from a storm, a power outage, or a furnace failure, the house begins to reveal its central weakness. It contains almost no thermal mass, no heavy material capable of storing warmth, the way old log cabins once did, and so its temperature plummets, pipes freeze, families gather under blankets, and rooms that felt safe moments earlier become inhospitable in less than half a day. Thermal insulation, in the modern sense, slows down heat transfer, but it does not store warmth. It behaves like a thin windbreaker that feels comfortable only while you keep generating heat beneath it, while thermal mass, the kind embedded in old log walls weighing hundreds of pounds each, behaves like a thick wool coat warmed by fire, and capable of radiating that stored heat for many hours even after the flame has gone out. And so, while modern homes may boast high R values and complex heating systems, they fail at the most critical moment, the moment the heat stops, because their materials, light and optimized for speed of construction, cannot hold warmth the way a medieval cabin can. And this single truth is the beginning of our journey toward understanding why structures built centuries ago, in remote forests under harsh skies, were not primitive shelters but highly efficient machines of survival, crafted from a deep knowledge of wood, air, stone, and fire. When we begin searching for the secret behind the warmth of medieval log cabins, the path always leads us into the forest, because the builders of those shelters did not begin with blueprints or insulation charts, but with an intimate understanding of the trees themselves, choosing their materials not by guesswork but by observing which trunks stood firmest through storms, which woods cracked least in bitter winters, and which trees held the slow, dense growth that would one day become walls capable of storing a full day's worth of heat. Imagine walking through an ancient Scandinavian pine forest in the quiet, pale light of early winter, the snow soft underfoot, the air carrying that deep resin scent of old trees, and somewhere among these towering trunks a medieval builder is selecting his future cabin, not by convenience, but by age, density, and the slow heartbeat of the tree revealed by the tightness of its rings, because only an old-growth pine or spruce, often more than 80 or even 100 years old, has the mass required to hold warmth like a stone sponge and release it gently through the long dark hours of the northern night. When dendrochronologists examine these old timbers centuries later, they find growth rings packed so tightly together you almost need a magnifying glass to count them, sometimes more than 100 rings in a single inch, a density modern plantation timber can't match, because today's trees grow too quickly, stretching out their fibers in pursuit of speed rather than strength. And this difference in density is not trivial. It is everything, because thermal capacity increases with mass, and a 12-inch log from an old-growth pine can weigh nearly twice as much as its modern equivalent, storing far more heat within its structure. But the genius of the old cabins is not only in the choice of the tree, it is also in the extraordinary precision with which each log is shaped, because medieval builders used a method called scribe-fit joinery, a laborious process in which each log is carved by hand to match the curvature of the one below it, creating a virtually airtight seal without the use of nails, foam, or modern mechanical fasteners. And as the logs settle and dry over the years, the structure becomes even tighter, the weight of the building pressing each timber into perfect contact with the next. Before the final gaps are sealed, the builders fill the seams with materials that modern science now confirms as remarkably effective: soft sphagnum moss gathered from wetlands, mixed with clay and reinforced with strands of animal hair, creating a chinking system that insulates, breathes, flexes, and resists decay all at the same time. The dried moss, with its tiny air-filled cellular structure, achieves insulation values comparable to fiberglass, while also resisting mold, insects, and moisture, something almost no manufactured material can claim. And as surprising as this may sound, these old walls, packed with moss and shaped by hand, often outperform modern properties built to strict energy codes, because when researchers test 18th century Norwegian log homes for air leakage, many of them are found to be tighter, sometimes significantly tighter than new houses wrapped in plastic barriers and stuffed with synthetic insulation. The result is a wall not only thick and massive, but alive in the way it responds to cold, absorbing warmth through the day and releasing it slowly through the night, with a thermal lag so significant that the cold of evening doesn't reach the interior surface until many hours after sunset, by which time the family inside has rekindled the central hearth and restarted the cycle. This is the forest's wisdom transformed into architecture, a living wall of dense timber working with physics rather than against it, storing heat like a battery, sealing against the wind like a ship's hull, and breathing with the seasons instead of fighting them. As we move deeper into the quiet mechanics of the medieval log cabin, we discover that its remarkable warmth in brutal cold does not come from the timber walls alone, but from the presence of a massive stone heart at its center, a heating system so deceptively simple, yet so ingeniously engineered that even modern thermal experts look at it with a kind of reverent curiosity, knowing that nothing produced today, not a furnace, not a heat pump, not a modern wood stove, truly replicates the steady, gentle, all-day warmth of a traditional masonry heater. Imagine, for a moment, a winter night in northern Scandinavia or rural Russia, the snow outside pressed into shimmering dunes beneath a pale moon, the temperature far below zero, the wind whispering like dry silk across the frozen ground, and inside a small, hand-built cabin stands a great block of stone or brick, often weighing 2 metric tons, silent and unmoving, yet holding in its core the memory of a fire that burned only briefly at dawn, a fire that lasted 10 or 15 minutes, but now sustains the family until midnight with a soft, radiant heat that fills the room like a quiet embrace. This structure, called a petke in Russia, a kakelung in Scandinavia, and a kachelofen in Germany, does not rely on the constant burning of logs or the endless roar of air like modern heating systems do. Instead, it uses a different philosophy entirely, one that treats fire as a quick, intense burst of energy, and treats stone as the true engine of warmth, storing that energy deep within its body and releasing it slowly and steadily over many hours, so that the room never swings from hot to cold, but stays in a comfortable, remarkably stable band of warmth. Inside the heater, hidden from view, a labyrinth of narrow brick channels winds its way upward and downward, forcing the hot smoke and gases from the fire to travel through a long path before exiting the chimney, and as those gases twist through the bends, called knees or chenya in Old Russian, they give up almost all their heat to the surrounding masonry, so much so that by the time the smoke reaches the top of the chimney, it is barely warm, a sign that the bricks have absorbed nearly everything the fire had to give. Unlike a metal stove, which gets scorching hot and then cools quickly, masonry has a slow heartbeat. It absorbs heat like a sponge, and then releases it in a soft, continuous stream, its surface warm to the touch but never dangerously hot. And this gentle, radiant heat warms objects and people directly, instead of simply blowing hot air around, creating a room where the floor feels warm, the bed feels warm, the very air seems calm and settled, and sleep comes easily because the temperature does not rise and fall in harsh cycles. Mark Twain, travelling through Russia in the 1800s, wrote with almost childlike amazement about these stoves, describing how a servant would burn a tiny bundle of thin pine sticks for just a few minutes each morning, lock the firebox afterward, and the entire home would remain warm until long after nightfall, all without smoke, without sudden drafts, and without the noisy interruptions of modern heating machinery. Medieval builders understood that radiant heat works best in small enclosed spaces, so they kept their cabins compact, their ceilings low, and their heater placed exactly in the center of the home, often forming one wall of a sleeping alcove, so that at night a person could lie with their back against the warm stone, drifting to sleep with the slow exhalation of stored heat behind them, a sensation so calming and reassuring that many ancient cultures wrote poems about it. And as researchers in Finland discovered when they reconstructed a traditional log cabin with a masonry heater, a single intense firing using about 30 pounds of wood was enough to hold the interior at roughly 65 degrees Fahrenheit for 18 hours straight, even in sub-zero temperatures, proving what medieval families always knew, that when wood, stone and space are used in harmony, a home becomes not just a shelter but a resilient, energy-rich cocoon capable of surviving cold, that modern houses simply cannot endure without constant mechanical assistance. When we step back and look at the medieval log cabin, not as a collection of clever tricks but as a single, unified organism, we begin to understand that its extraordinary warmth comes from the harmony of many elements working together, each one supporting the next, with a kind of quiet intelligence, the way a forest ecosystem functions, not through one dominant species but through the delicate cooperation of soil, roots, moss, water and wind, all balancing each other in ways that feel almost instinctual. The foundation, for instance, is not simply a place to rest the walls. Medieval builders raised their cabins on stone piers or short dry stacked footings, lifting the wooden floor above the frozen earth so that cold from the ground could not bleed directly into the living space. And beneath the floorboards they sometimes packed sawdust or moss to create an additional layer of breathable insulation that prevented drafts from swirling upward while still allowing moisture to escape, preserving the structural integrity of the wood for generations. Above this, the massive log walls formed a kind of thermal reservoir, their combined mass acting not just as a barrier to the cold, but as a slow, rhythmic engine of heat storage, absorbing warmth from the masonry heater throughout the day, and releasing it steadily long after the fire had gone out, and the tight scribe-fit joinery ensured that the walls did not behave like a sieve, but like the hull of a well-built ship, flexing slightly with each season, yet remaining nearly airtight even in storms where the wind howled like a living thing. Between the logs, the chinking made from sphagnum moss, clay, and animal hair functioned as a multi-layered seal that modern materials still struggle to replicate, because the moss, with its natural acidity and sponge-like cell structure, kept insects, fungal growth, and drafts at bay, while the clay locked everything into place, and the hair acted as a natural reinforcing fiber, creating a material that moved with the wood instead of against it, and in doing so prevented the cracking and splitting that often plague modern houses built from rigid synthetic components. Inside the home, space itself became part of the heating strategy. Ceilings were low, rooms were small, and the central masonry heater radiated its warmth outward in every direction, creating gentle thermal gradients throughout the cabin, with the main living area kept warmest, and the sleeping areas slightly cooler, not because medieval families tolerated discomfort, but because they understood that temperature did not need to be uniform to feel comfortable. Warm air where you sit and eat, cooler air where you sleep under thick blankets, and storage spaces that could remain just above freezing without wasting precious fuel. Even the chimney was designed with purpose rather than rushing heat away from the home. It often passed through upper spaces, warming them as it travelled toward the roof, and in some designs small compartments built into the heater itself, called zapatia and podpatia in traditional Russian stoves, served as warm drying areas for boots, clothing, and food, making use of every bit of residual heat while ensuring that nothing inside the cabin ever became damp or cold. And perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of this entire system is its resilience, because unlike modern homes which demand constant electricity, constant fuel, and constant mechanical intervention, the medieval cabin thrives on simplicity. A few minutes of fire each day, a structure built from materials that store heat by their very nature, and a layout that works with physics rather than attempting to overpower it with machinery. If for some reason the fire could not be lit for a day or two, perhaps a blizzard blocked the door, or illness kept a family from tending the hearth, the cabin would not drop to freezing. Its walls and masonry would hold on to their stored heat, slowly releasing it over many hours, protecting everything inside from frost, and giving the family time to recover or wait out the storm without fear of the cold claiming their home. It is in this complete integration, foundation, walls, chinking, layout, heater, airflow, and thermal mass, that the medieval cabin becomes something more than a building. It becomes a coherent system optimized for survival, a structure born from centuries of observation and experience, built not to impress or to sell quickly, but to endure, to shelter, and to warm. As we quietly shift our attention from the deep wisdom of medieval craftsmanship to the bright, hurried world of modern construction, a gentle sense of irony settles over the comparison, because somewhere along the way between industrialization, mass production, and the pursuit of speed, we traded methods that were slow but enduring for methods that were fast but fragile, and the result is a housing system that looks efficient on paper, yet collapses almost immediately when the power stops flowing. The first force that pushed us away from old ways was industrialization itself, because once sawmills began turning logs into neat dimensional boards, and once factories began producing nails by the thousands, it became far quicker and cheaper to build houses using light frames instead of massive timbers, and in a rapidly expanding society where towns were rising overnight, and millions of homes were needed in a matter of decades, slowness, no matter how effective, became something industries simply could not afford. Then came the age of cheap energy, that long chapter of history when coal, oil, and natural gas poured out of the earth in abundance, and heating a drafty house cost only a few dollars a month, making efficiency seem unnecessary, even old-fashioned, and in such an era the skills required to shape dense logs by hand or construct multi-ton masonry heaters no longer seemed relevant, so they faded quietly, generation by generation, until only small pockets of craftsmen in remote regions still remembered how to build structures that could survive harsh winters without the crutch of modern systems. After World War II, with millions of returning soldiers and an urgent demand for rapid housing, the building industry accelerated even further toward methods optimized not for longevity or resilience, but for speed of assembly and low initial cost, and the suburban home became a product, something assembled quickly, sold quickly, and rarely designed with the idea that it should endure for a century or more, because financial systems rewarded homes that were cheap to build rather than homes that were cheap to maintain. And so modern construction embraced materials that were light instead of dense, synthetic instead of natural, rigid instead of flexible, and effective only when paired with furnaces, motors, blowers, sensors, and ducts, creating a system where comfort comes not from the architecture itself, but from a continuous stream of mechanical effort, meaning that a modern home, warm and pleasant when everything is functioning, becomes shockingly vulnerable the moment that machinery falls silent. What was lost in this transition was not merely a set of building techniques, but an entire philosophy, a way of understanding that a home should be a passive shelter first, and an active system second, a place where the walls themselves help maintain warmth, instead of functioning as thin partitions dependent on a constant supply of artificially generated heat. In many cold regions, people still living in old log cabins burn far less fuel than their neighbors in modern houses, sometimes by a factor of 4 or 5, because their homes are designed to store heat, not merely resist its loss, and so these structures remain habitable even during prolonged power outages, while modern homes, no matter how well insulated, can become dangerously cold in less than 24 hours. The saddest irony is that the knowledge was never flawed. It was simply slow, labor-intensive, and unfriendly to mass production, and so it slipped through the cracks of progress, leaving us with a world full of homes that look sturdy yet behave like delicate machines, always a few hours away from freezing whenever the lights go out. When researchers set out to test whether these medieval methods truly outperform modern construction, they did not rely on romantic stories or old family legends, but instead built controlled experiments in some of the coldest regions on Earth. And the results they recorded, quiet, measured, almost mathematical, confirmed what generations of northern builders already knew in their bones, that a properly built log cabin with a masonry heater is not a quaint relic, but a highly efficient thermal machine whose performance rivals or surpasses homes filled with modern technology. One of the clearest examples comes from Fairbanks, Alaska, where winter temperatures often fall to levels that silence breath and stiffen wood, and research teams constructed 2 nearly identical cabins, one using standard 2x6 framing with R19 insulation, sealed with vapor barriers and heated by a propane furnace, and the other built in the traditional style with 10-inch logs fitted tight by scribe joinery and warmed by a central masonry heater, and placed them side by side to see how each responded to the unforgiving cold. The modern cabin, filled with the latest insulation and mechanical systems, maintained a pleasant interior temperature only as long as the furnace stayed running, but the moment they shut off the flames to simulate a power outage, the temperature inside fell sharply, dropping to 40 degrees Fahrenheit in just 8 hours and reaching the frigid outdoor conditions within a single day, turning the structure into an uninhabitable shell as quickly as if the walls themselves had surrendered to the winter. The log cabin, by contrast, behaved like a creature with slow, steady breath. Its masonry heater consumed only about 35 pounds of wood each day, roughly the weight of a medium-sized dog, and after a single morning firing its interior temperature rose gently to 70 degrees, then drifted downward to the mid-60s through the evening. And even when researchers left it completely unheated for 72 hours, the temperature never dropped below the high 40s, warm enough to protect food, water, and life. In another study, conducted by the Norwegian Institute of Wood Technology, researchers examined historic log homes more than 2 centuries old, many built before the industrial age, and found that these structures, with nothing more than careful chinking and seasoned logs, often leaked less air than newly built homes designed to meet strict modern energy codes, and thermal imaging on winter nights revealed that the cabins shed almost no heat through drafts or hidden gaps, their thick walls glowing uniformly with stored warmth like banks of living embers. These tests demonstrated something profound: that modern metrics such as R-value, while useful, fail to capture the full behavior of materials like dense wood, because R-value measures only how quickly heat moves through a material in steady conditions, and ignores the ability of a wall to absorb and release heat over time, meaning a log wall rated at R10 can outperform a modern wall rated at R40 in the real world simply because its thermal mass smooths out temperature swings, rather than allowing interiors to collapse into cold the moment heat production stops. In fact, several regions have quietly updated their building codes to exempt log homes from standard R-value requirements, acknowledging that thermal mass defies the narrow formulas normally used to judge cold climate performance. And this shift signals a deeper truth: that our ancestors, guided not by spreadsheets but by observation and necessity, built homes that manage heat with a wisdom we are only now beginning to quantify. Through these experiments, the old methods, dense timber, tight joinery, breathable chinking, and radiant heat, proved themselves not just viable but superior in resilience. Because in the real world, it is not the home that stays warm while electricity flows that matters most, but the one that stays warm when everything else fails, and on that measure the medieval cabin stands undefeated. As we arrive gently at the point where past and present meet, it becomes clear that the lessons hidden inside those wooden walls are not relics of a vanished world, but living principles, simple, sturdy, quietly powerful, that we can still apply today, because the physics that warmed medieval families through nights of frozen darkness has not changed, only our relationship to it has, and somewhere along our journey of progress we forgot that the most resilient homes are those that work with nature rather than trying to overpower it. The first lesson is that dense materials store comfort, because wood grown slowly over decades holds heat the way a sponge holds water, taking in energy steadily and releasing it with a calm, even pulse that modern systems rarely match. And while insulation is valuable, it is not a substitute for thermal mass, because insulation slows heat transfer but cannot keep a house warm when heat production stops, while a log or a stone hearth absorbs warmth deeply enough to sustain life through long, cold hours without any moving parts. The second lesson is that airtightness does not require plastic membranes or manufactured seals, because scribe-fit joinery, shaped by hand or precise tools, creates a contact patch between logs so exact that air has no path through it, and natural chinking made from moss and clay moves with the seasons instead of fighting them, expanding when needed, tightening when necessary, and maintaining a flexible barrier that can last for centuries without rotting, cracking, or failing the way synthetic materials often do. The third lesson is that radiant heat is fundamentally different from forced air heat, because warm stone, warm brick, and warm timber touch the human body with a gentle steadiness that relaxes muscles and quiets the nervous system, while air-based systems heat rooms unevenly, drying the air and creating pockets of discomfort that force furnaces to run endlessly in an attempt to overcome their own inefficiency, and the result is a cycle of dependency that medieval cabins simply did not need. The fourth lesson is that smaller, intentional spaces heat better, because a home designed with compact rooms and low ceilings keeps warmth close to the people who need it, rather than allowing it to rise and disperse. And medieval families understood this intuitively, using thermal zoning to separate warm spaces for daily life from cooler spaces for storage or sleep, creating a layered environment that saved fuel without sacrificing comfort. The fifth lesson is perhaps the most important of all, A resilient home is not the one that stays warm while the systems are running, but the one that stays warm after they stop. And in this regard, medieval cabins far outperform modern houses, because they do not rely on continuous mechanical intervention. Instead, they rely on principles that continue to function even when human attention, electricity, or fuel are briefly absent. And so, at the end of this quiet journey through forests, fire, stone, and time, we find that the wisdom of medieval builders was not primitive at all, but deeply practical, guided by an understanding of materials and seasons, guided by necessity, and guided by the simple truth that a home must first protect life before it provides comfort or convenience. If we choose to apply these principles now, whether through modern log construction, masonry heaters, hybrid timber mass walls, or simply by designing spaces that work with the natural behavior of heat, we could create homes that cost less to operate, last longer, remain safe during outages, and offer the kind of steady, calming warmth that helps the mind rest and the body sleep, just as it did for those who lived through winters far harsher than most of us will ever know. When we look at the quiet power of these ancient building principles, a subtle realization begins to settle over the mind, one that drifts in like the warmth of a masonry stove long after its fire has gone out. Because the story of medieval log cabins is not only about survival in cold climates, nor merely about craftsmanship or materials, but about the way humans once understood their relationship with the environment, approaching nature not as an adversary to be subdued with technology, but as a partner whose laws had to be respected, studied, and woven carefully into daily life. In that older world, a builder did not measure efficiency with instruments or formulas. Instead, he learned by watching how frost formed on the north side of a tree, how logs twisted as they dried, how stone held the sun's heat hours after dusk, how moss absorbed water yet resisted decay, and from these observations he shaped a home that worked with the natural tendencies of each material, creating structures that required almost no maintenance, no machinery, and no continuous input of energy, yet provided shelter warm enough for infants and elders through winter nights so cold they could kill a person in minutes. And when we compare this ancient resilience with modern fragility, it becomes impossible not to wonder how we allowed a house, one of the most fundamental human needs, to become something so dependent on unbroken chains of electricity, fuel, and mechanical parts that a brief outage can render it uninhabitable, while a cabin built with hand tools and guided only by intuition can stand for centuries and keep its occupants safe through storms, blizzards, and long nights of deep winter. This contrast reveals something deeper than construction failures. It shows how easily societies can drift away from knowledge that once felt essential, how often convenience replaces understanding, and how progress can sometimes conceal its own blind spots by focusing on what can be built quickly rather than what can endure. And as a result, we find ourselves in homes that feel advanced but behave, in moments of crisis, like tents made of expensive materials. Yet this does not need to be a story of loss or regret, because much of that old wisdom still exists, preserved in the memories of northern builders, in the surviving cabins of Scandinavia and Russia, in the blueprints of masonry heater craftsmen, and in a growing movement of people who are beginning to question whether speed and low cost should remain the primary goals of construction, when longevity, comfort, and resilience serve human life far more deeply. Some modern builders have already begun returning to these principles, experimenting with hybrid systems that combine timber framing with thick mass walls, designing homes that employ modern windows yet retain the thermal inertia of old logs, and constructing masonry heaters that blend medieval heating logic with contemporary materials, creating living spaces that stay warm even when technology falters, and that offer comfort not through constant mechanical effort, but through the quiet physics of stored heat. And as these experiments multiply, they suggest a future in which the best of the old world and the best of the new might meet in a way that creates homes more human, more stable, and more attuned to the rhythms of the environment, homes that do not fracture under the first sign of winter, but breathe with the season and shelter life with a gentle, enduring strength. As we drift deeper into the heart of this investigation, the path forward begins to resemble a quiet circle, because the more closely we examine the forgotten physics behind medieval log cabins, the more clearly we see that the solutions we search for today, resilient homes, lower energy use, structures that stay warm without constant power, are not inventions waiting to be discovered, but memories waiting to be reclaimed. And this realization unfolds not with the force of revelation, but with the gentle ease of a truth we somehow always knew. In recent years, architects and engineers, especially those working in cold climates, have begun to revisit the principles we have explored tonight, and they are finding that when dense, slowly grown timber is used as a primary structural and thermal material, the resulting walls behave not like barriers but like batteries, absorbing warmth during the day and releasing it at night, smoothing temperature swings, and creating interior climates that feel calmer and more stable than those governed by the constant on-off cycle of a forced air furnace. Some experimental homes combine thick mass timber walls with modern triple-pane windows, creating structures that store heat with the patience of an old cabin while enjoying the durability and wind tightness of new glazing. And in these spaces, the temperature changes so slowly that even in a power outage, the house remains comfortable for days, not hours, a performance metric that feels almost shocking when compared to standard construction, yet is perfectly normal in the context of the homes our ancestors built by instinct. Other builders, inspired by Scandinavian tradition, have revived the art of the masonry heater, shaping multi-ton stone cores inside contemporary living rooms, where a single intense burn each morning fills the home with warmth until well past nightfall, and families gather near the radiant stone not because they must, but because there is a kind of ancient comfort in feeling warmth that comes not from blowing air or mechanical noise, but from the slow exhalation of heated stone that holds the memory of fire long after the flame has vanished. There are even architects who have begun designing compact, intentionally arranged floor plans that echo the thermal logic of medieval cabins, placing bedrooms near the central heater, clustering daily use spaces where radiant warmth can reach them most effectively, and allowing peripheral zones, mudrooms, pantries, storage lofts to remain cooler, forming a gentle temperature gradient that reduces energy demand while making the home feel naturally layered and inviting. These experiments reveal something important, that the wisdom of medieval builders was neither accidental nor quaint, but the culmination of centuries of observation, adaptation, and lived experience. And when we apply these principles today, using improved tools and materials, we can create homes that exceed modern performance standards, while providing the kind of deep comfort that machines alone cannot replicate. And perhaps the most powerful insight of all is that these homes built with thermal mass, airtight joinery, breathable natural fibers, and radiant stone are not only efficient, they are resilient in a way that modern construction rarely achieves, capable of staying warm through storms, blackouts, fuel shortages, or equipment failures, because their core functionality does not depend on constant external support, but on the inherent properties of their materials and the elegant physics of storing heat slowly and releasing it even more slowly. As this knowledge returns to the mainstream conversation, we begin to understand that the homes of the future might look surprisingly familiar, shaped not by nostalgia but by function, drawing from the past not as an aesthetic but as a science, blending old principles with modern precision to produce structures that cost less to operate, last for generations, and remain comfortable even when the world outside grows cold and uncertain. As we continue drifting through this quiet exploration of how earlier generations understood the cold, it becomes increasingly clear that what they built was not just a type of house, but a philosophy, an approach to warmth shaped by patience, observation, and the knowledge that a home must work with the rhythms of the natural world rather than in defiance of them, because in an age before electricity and central heating, a structure that could not regulate its own climate simply did not survive long enough to become part of tradition. To those builders, warmth was not something produced by machines, but something cultivated. The way one might cultivate a fire in the hearth, or the way one might cultivate a garden, understanding that the comfort of a winter night depended not on force but on preparation, selecting the right trees from the right slopes of the forest, fitting logs together until even the wind could not find a path between them, raising a stone heater whose heavy core would remember the heat long after the fire faded, and arranging rooms so that every corner of the home either shared warmth or relieved it in a way that felt natural to the body. In this older world, the idea of fighting against the cold with brute force, the way modern homes rely on constant mechanical heating, would have seemed wasteful and even dangerous, because the true test of a home was not how warm it remained when the fire was burning, but how slowly it surrendered that warmth when the fire went out. And this slow surrender, this gentle release of stored heat, was the measure that distinguished a shelter from a liability. This philosophy endures because it speaks to something deeper than construction. It speaks to the way humans once listened to their environments, learning not just what materials could do, but what they wanted to do, choosing systems that aligned with nature's patterns instead of trying to overpower them. And as a result, the homes they built were not merely structures but ecosystems, breathing, settling, expanding, and contracting with the seasons in a manner that preserved comfort without demanding constant intervention. Even now, when we touch the thick walls of an old log cabin or stand beside a masonry heater still radiating warmth long after its fire has gone cold, we can feel this philosophy in our bones, understanding instinctively that there is a kind of wisdom in slowness, a recognition that sometimes the most reliable forms of comfort are those that require no electricity, no motors, no thermostats, only materials arranged with care and a respect for the laws of heat that govern all living things. And perhaps this is why these ancient principles have begun returning to the modern conversation, not because they are nostalgic or quaint, but because they represent a kind of resilience we increasingly realize we have lost. A reminder that technology is most powerful when it builds upon nature rather than ignoring it, and that a well-designed home should protect its inhabitants not only when everything is functioning perfectly, but especially when everything has gone wrong. As more architects, homeowners, and researchers revisit these forgotten methods, they rediscover an idea that feels surprisingly radical in our age of constant energy consumption. That a truly warm home does not chase heat, it preserves it, nurtures it, and holds it gently through the night, the way a thick log holds the memory of sunlight or a stone hearth holds the echo of a flame. As our journey continues into the quiet spaces between past and present, we begin to understand that the relevance of these ancient building traditions is not limited to historical curiosity or a romantic vision of simpler times, but extends directly into the challenges of the modern world, where strains on energy systems, increasingly unpredictable winters, and the fragility of long supply chains all remind us how dependent our homes have become on forces beyond our control, and how valuable it might be to rediscover methods designed to endure without constant external support. In this changing landscape, the medieval log cabin, so humble in appearance, so unassuming in its simplicity, offers a blueprint for a different kind of future, one in which houses do not merely consume heat, but retain it, where warmth is not something delivered minute by a machine, but something absorbed, stored, and released by the building itself, allowing families to remain safe even during outages, storms, or shortages that would render modern construction uninhabitable in a matter of hours. Designers today are beginning to look at these principles with fresh eyes, recognizing that a building with true resilience must be able to maintain livable temperatures independent of constant power, and that such resilience is not achieved with high-tech solutions alone, but through thoughtful blending of materials with natural thermal properties, dense timbers, earthen walls, masonry cores, and through layouts that minimize heat loss by keeping most used spaces clustered around sources of stored warmth. Some architects now propose hybrid homes that combine the airtight precision of modern framing with the mass of large timbers or engineered wood panels. creating walls that not only resist heat loss, but also hold thermal energy the way old log walls did. And these hybrid structures often outperform conventional homes in both comfort and stability, remaining warm for far longer when heating systems fail and reducing fuel consumption dramatically when systems are operating. Others experiment with installing modern masonry heaters inside conventional homes, using improved firebrick and clean-burning designs that adhere to today's standards while maintaining the ancient principle of burning fast and storing deeply. And the families who adopt these systems describe a kind of comfort that feels different from mechanical heat, gentler, quieter, more even, almost like sunlight diffused through stone rather than the harsh cycle of air that blows hot, then cold, then hot again. In rural regions where power outages are common, builders are rediscovering floor plans that mirror the logic of medieval cabins, with compact central living spaces that absorb and hold radiant heat, surrounded by peripheral zones that can be allowed to run cooler to save energy, forming a natural thermal hierarchy that keeps the heart of the home warm, while reducing overall fuel demands and ensuring resilience even in emergencies. These ideas do not ask us to abandon modern technology, but to use it in harmony with the older, slower physics that once governed survival, reminding us that while innovation is valuable, it is most effective when layered onto foundations of proven wisdom rather than replacing them outright, and that a home designed to store warmth rather than constantly chase it offers a kind of stability that transcends trends, economic changes, or even climate shifts. As more people see their heating bills rise, as storms knock out power grids, as winters grow increasingly unpredictable, the quiet logic of medieval construction begins to echo through the modern world with surprising clarity, offering not nostalgia but solutions. Solutions that worked before, that still work today, and that may very well define the resilient homes of tomorrow. As we continue this quiet descent through the layers of forgotten building wisdom, it becomes clear that the strength of medieval cabins lies not only in the ingenuity of their builders, but in the inherent reliability of the materials themselves, because long before composites, plastics, synthetic foams, and mechanical systems entered the world of construction, people survived winters by choosing substances that behaved predictably, aged gracefully, and responded to cold with patience rather than brittleness, forming structures whose performance improved with time instead of degrading with each passing season. Wood, especially the slow-grown old-growth timber of the northern forests, is not only a structural material but a living archive of thermal memory, filled with dense fibers that once guided sap and sunlight, but later become channels for storing warmth. And as those fibers dry and settle into place over years and decades, the logs tighten, harden, and gain stability, creating homes that do not weaken with age but mature into deeper strength, something that almost no modern material can claim. Stone and brick, which form the hearts of masonry heaters, possess a different but equally vital kind of resilience, because while metals warp and burn out and plastic components crack under heat cycles, the mineral structure of firebrick absorbs tens of thousands of thermal shocks over its lifetime without losing integrity, allowing these heaters to outlive generation after generation of their owners, sometimes functioning perfectly for a century or more, with only minor maintenance, proving that durability is not always measured in engineered complexity, but often in elemental simplicity. Even the humble moss used for chinking demonstrates a type of performance that modern synthetics struggle to match, because its cellular structure, formed in wetlands over thousands of evolutionary cycles, remains springy when dry, expands when damp, resists decay with its natural acidity, and maintains its insulating properties far longer than foams that shrink, crack, or off-gas over time, meaning that an old cabin's seams often remain effective centuries after the moss was first packed into them. These natural materials do not fail catastrophically. They do not depend on power grids, microchips, or supply chains. They do not need replacement when systems glitch or sensors fail. They simply exist, functioning because the laws of physics that govern them are as consistent today as they were 1,000 years ago, allowing warmth to accumulate slowly and seep outward, the way heat rises through soil or sunlight lingers in stone long after dusk. And when we compare this quiet stability to the complexity of modern homes, filled with pumps, blowers, compressors, thermostats, ductwork, and insulation materials that lose their value over time, we begin to understand that our vulnerability is not a failure of design but a consequence of forgetting that some of the most effective solutions require no electricity, no machinery, and no maintenance schedule, only careful construction and respect for the inherent strengths of nature's building blocks. This realization does not pull us backward into the past, but gently nudges us toward a more balanced future, one where technology supports natural principles rather than attempting to compensate for ignoring them, and where the materials chosen for our homes are judged not only by how quickly they can be installed or how cheaply they can be manufactured, but by how calmly they hold warmth through a winter night, how patiently they weather storms, and how reliably they carry human life when modern systems fall silent. In this way, the medieval log cabin becomes both a memory and a guide, pointing us toward a kind of construction that embraces the strengths of the earth rather than trying to outsmart them, reminding us that sometimes the surest path to comfort comes not from inventing something new, but from rediscovering something we once knew by heart. As we follow this quiet thread deeper into the nature of medieval cabins, a gentle truth begins to emerge, one that settles over the mind the way snow settles over the forest. Because unlike modern homes that begin to deteriorate from the moment the last nail is driven, these older structures grow more stable, more airtight, and more comfortable as the years pass, forming a bond with their occupants that feels almost alive, as if the cabin itself were maturing alongside the people who live within it. When a medieval log cabin is first built, the logs are still adjusting to their new purpose, drying gradually, shrinking slightly, and settling into a position that will remain nearly unchanged for generations. And during those first few years, the walls tighten, the joints compress, and the chinking bed of moss and clay adapts to every shift, sealing gaps, filling micro spaces, and settling into a long-term equilibrium that is more like the growth of a living organism than the aging of a machine. By the time a decade passes, a well-built cabin becomes tighter than when it was new, its walls increasingly dense and its thermal performance improving each winter, because the wood, losing moisture cell by cell, becomes even better at storing heat, its fibers locking into a kind of structural harmony that no synthetic insulation can replicate. And the warmth that radiates from those logs on a cold night carries a quiet permanence, as if the home were remembering every fire it has ever held. The masonry heater, too, becomes better with age, developing small micro cracks and internal channels that don't weaken the structure but actually increase its heating efficiency, allowing heat to circulate more smoothly through the labyrinth hidden inside the stone. And as decades go by, the heater becomes a more perfect version of itself, radiating warmth with a softness that new heaters sometimes lack, a warmth that comforts the body without overwhelming the senses. This quality, this ability to improve over time rather than degrade, is one of the most remarkable features of traditional construction, because it means that the longer a cabin exists, the more deeply it serves its purpose, growing into something that requires less attention, less fuel, less intervention, while still offering the same or greater protection against brutal cold. And this stands in stark contrast to modern houses, which begin accumulating maintenance demands almost immediately, furnaces that must be replaced, insulation that settles and loses value, windows that fog, mechanical parts that fail without warning. To live in such a cabin is to experience a kind of companionship through the seasons, a slow and steady partnership, where the building adapts to your rhythms just as you adapt to its storing your heat during the day, guarding it through the night, and holding enough of it in reserve to protect you even if a storm, an illness, or an accident prevents you from tending the fire as usual. These qualities make the medieval cabin not just a shelter but a long-term ally against the cold, a structure designed not to impress visitors or maximize short-term profit, but to endure as a quiet, faithful presence capable of keeping life warm and safe through winters so harsh that even modern infrastructure sometimes fails, reminding us that strength is not always loud or mechanical. Sometimes it is simply the timeless reliability of materials shaped with care and allowed to age in peace. As we move even further into this quiet reflection on medieval log cabins, the focus shifts naturally from the structure itself to the people who lived within it. Because a home is not only a collection of walls and a heater and a roof, but a vessel that holds the rhythms of human life. And when we imagine families passing through long winters in these cabins, children growing, elders resting, seasons turning, the building becomes something more than construction. It becomes a partner in survival, a silent guardian shaping the memories and routines of every life inside it. In the deep cold of northern winters, where the nights stretched for many hours and storms could isolate a community for days, the cabin became the physical anchor of existence, a place where the warmth was not only physical but emotional, where the gentle radiation of the masonry heater filled the rooms with a sense of calm continuity, and where the thick log walls muffled the howl of the wind until the world outside felt distant, softened, and almost unreal, allowing the family within to rest even when the landscape beyond was locked in ice. Children would fall asleep on benches warmed by the stone core, their small bodies curled under blankets that smelled faintly of smoke and pine resin, while their parents whispered in low voices beside the hearth, discussing chores, planning the next day, or simply listening to the crackling memory of the morning fire that still lived within the masonry. And above them the logs, dried, seasoned and strong, held the heat like old friends who knew how to protect those in their care. For elders, the cabin offered a kind of sanctuary unmatched by modern homes, because radiant heat warms the body differently than forced air. It reaches deep into joints and muscles, easing the tension of cold on aging bones, and so many elderly people found relief in the steady warmth of a cabin heated by stone, able to sit peacefully through long evenings while outside the frozen world pressed in with fierce indifference. Meals were prepared near the heater, drying racks placed above warm alcoves, and the entire rhythm of the household harmonized with the thermal heartbeat of the building, rising and falling gently as the masonry heater absorbed and released its stored energy, creating a daily cadence that shaped the lives within the cabin. In the same way a tide shapes the curve of a shoreline, what made these homes truly extraordinary was their reliability. Families could trust that the cabin would stay warm even if someone could not rise early to tend the fire, even if illness struck, even if the weather turned violent, and this reliability wove itself into the psychology of daily life, offering a deep sense of security at a time when survival was often uncertain. And this emotional comfort, this faith that the home would hold warmth, was as important as the physical heat itself. Through generations, cabins were maintained and passed down, each new family improving the chinking, replacing a worn beam, or adding a new layer of stone to the heater, and in this way the cabins became repositories of family history, carrying the marks of every winter survived, every festival celebrated, every story told by firelight, their walls darkened slightly each year by smoke and time, their floors smoothed by thousands of footsteps. A cabin like this did not simply shelter a family, it shaped their identity, teaching them patience through the slow heating of stone, teaching them resilience through the long endurance of the logs, and teaching them gratitude for the warmth held in materials that asked for nothing except respect and care. One of the most revealing truths about the medieval log cabin emerges not during a normal day, when the fire crackles and the rhythms of life move gently through the space, but in the rare moments when the fire goes out, when illness keeps someone in bed, or a blizzard closes the path to the woodpile, or simple exhaustion allows the family to sleep longer than usual. And it is in these moments, when no heat is being added, that the true character of the home reveals itself with remarkable clarity. In a modern house, this is the moment of fragility. the moment when the dependency on constant mechanical heating becomes painfully clear. The temperature begins to fall almost immediately, drifting downward hour by hour until the rooms feel hollow and the air bites at exposed skin. And if the power is out or the furnace has failed, the home becomes uninhabitable with startling speed, its thin materials offering no buffer, no stored warmth, no margin of safety for the family inside. But in a medieval cabin, the experience is entirely different because the fire is not the only source of heat, only the spark that charges the entire system. And once the walls of dense timber and the 2 tons of stone in the masonry heater have absorbed that energy, they continue to release it long after the flames have died, each log radiating its stored warmth into the room with a quiet, unwavering patience that feels almost like a presence standing watch through the long, cold hours. The children might sleep late, wrapped in blankets near the stone core, unaware that the fire has long since faded. The parents might rise slowly, noticing that the air is cooler but still comfortable, a gentle reminder that the home is taking care of them, even in their absence. And when they touch the surface of the masonry heater, they feel that steady, soothing warmth still lingering beneath the stone, proof that a well-built home does not depend on constant tending, but carries its heat forward like a silent promise. Even after a full day without firing, the cabin often remains above freezing, its interior held within a safe, livable range by the combined thermal inertia of wood and stone. And this slow release of warmth can continue for 2 or even 3 days, depending on the size of the heater, the thickness of the logs, and the layout of the rooms, offering a level of resilience that modern homes rarely achieve without backup generators or emergency supplies. This quality, the ability to remain habitable even when the fire sleeps, is what separates a survival structure from a convenient structure, because it acknowledges the reality that life does not always unfold according to schedule, and that a home should protect its occupants not only when everything goes according to plan, but especially when it does not, offering time to recover, time to adapt, and time to relight the fire when circumstances allow. In these moments, when the world outside may be swept in snow, and the wind may be carving patterns into the drifts, the medieval cabin becomes a quiet refuge, its slow pulse of warmth, a reminder that resilience is not built through force or complexity, but through thoughtful design and materials arranged to collaborate with the laws of heat rather than resist them. And this collaboration creates a kind of safety that is both physical and emotional, a reassurance that the home stands with you, not against the winter. As we continue drifting through this quiet exploration, another dimension of the medieval cabin reveals itself, one that does not exist in blueprints or heating charts, but in the quiet spaces of the human mind, because the warmth created by these old structures was not only a physical sensation, but also a psychological refuge, shaping how people thought, slept, and moved through the long winters, creating an emotional landscape where the home itself became a steady and calming presence. In the thin-walled homes of today, where temperatures rise and fall quickly with every furnace cycle, where drafts slip silently across floors, and where mechanical sounds break the stillness of night, the body remains subtly alert, always sensing the fluctuations in the environment. But in a medieval cabin, heated by stone and wrapped in thick timber, warmth moves slowly, steadily smoothing out the peaks and valleys of temperature, so thoroughly that the nervous system, freed from the need to constantly react, sinks naturally into deeper rest. Children growing up in these cabins developed an intuitive sense of the day's rhythm based on the slow fading of warmth from the stone heater, a sensation as gentle and dependable as the dimming of evening light. And this predictability created a feeling of safety that modern systems, with their abrupt cycles and mechanical noise, rarely reproduce, because radiant heat does not rush, does not blow, does not startle the senses. It simply exists, like a soft world surrounding the body. Adults, too, experienced this psychological comfort, as the quiet, even temperature encouraged slower breathing, steadier movements, and a kind of mental clarity that comes from living in a space where the environment does not demand constant attention. and so the cabin became not just a shelter, but a sanctuary, a place where the mind could rest as deeply as the body, soothed by the steady exhalation of heat from the stone heart at its center. Elders found in these cabins a kind of relief rarely offered by modern homes, because radiant warmth penetrates muscles and joints with a gentle persistence that forced air heating cannot match, and the low, even temperatures reduced the daily strain of living in harsh climates, allowing older generations to find comfort even when the world outside pressed dangerously close to the edge of survival. Even the soundscape of the cabin contributed to this sense of tranquility. The soft creaking of settling logs, the muffled sigh of wind meeting thick timber, the faint warmth radiating like a heartbeat from the masonry heater, and the quiet conversations of a family sheltered from the cold, all blending into an environment where the home felt almost alive, holding its warmth and its silence with the same steady patience. In such a place, sleep came not as an escape from discomfort, but as a natural extension of comfort itself, encouraged by the slow decline of temperature through the night, a decline so gradual it felt like a soothing lullaby. And this gentle environmental stability has been shown, even in modern studies, to promote deeper and more restorative sleep, confirming scientifically what medieval families understood through experience alone. And so we begin to see that the cabin's warmth was not only a triumph of physics or craftsmanship, but a subtle form of mental architecture, shaping memory, behavior, and rest in ways that modern homes often overlook, because the deepest comfort comes not from the amount of heat produced, but from the way that heat is held, dispersed and woven into the rhythms of daily life. As we continue drifting through this landscape of old knowledge, it becomes clear that medieval log cabins were not only shelters but quiet teachers, shaping the rhythms of life through the simple physics of warmth and the unhurried pace of natural materials, because living in a home that warms slowly and cools slowly teaches a person patience, awareness, and a kind of seasonal humility that modern construction rarely encourages. For families who lived in these cabins, winter was not something to fight against through constant mechanical effort, but something to move with, to prepare for in advance, and to navigate with the understanding that cold is not an enemy, but a force that must be respected, planned for, and met with the steady resilience of wood, stone, and human routine. And in this way the cabin became an extension of the natural world, rather than a shield built in defiance of it. Each morning the day began, not with the sharp roar of a furnace, but with the soft ritual of tending the masonry heater, opening the firebox, placing a few dry logs inside, lighting them quickly so the flames rose hot and fast, then closing the door and letting the stone take over, absorbing that burst of energy with a deep, silent calm that set the tone for the entire day. And this ritual, simple, brief, unhurried, became a kind of meditation, grounding the family in both responsibility and peace. As the fire slept within the stone, the house settled into its natural rhythm, warming gently through the morning, remaining steady through the afternoon, and cooling ever so slightly in the evening, creating a daily cycle that aligned perfectly with the rhythms of human activity, encouraging wakefulness when the cabin was warmest and inviting sleep, as the temperature fell softly through the night, not abruptly but with a gradual ease that coaxed the body into rest. This slow, predictable rhythm extended into every aspect of life. Chores were done in the warmth near the heater, meals simmered on its residual heat, clothes dried in small alcoves warmed by its sides, and even the design of the cabin reflected these natural cycles, with living spaces clustered close to the stone heart and storage areas allowed to drift cooler, forming an intuitive layout where warmth guided movement and cold marked the edges of the home like gentle boundaries. Living in such a space meant becoming attuned to the smallest cues, the feel of the floorboards beneath bare feet, the temperature of the logs at dusk, the faint shift in the air that signaled when it was time to add wood again, and this awareness of environment cultivated a sense of partnership with the home, a feeling that the cabin and its inhabitants worked together to maintain comfort, each doing its part without excess or haste. Modern homes, by contrast, often disconnect us from these cues, insulating us from the immediate feedback of temperature changes through layers of machinery that compensate automatically, leaving us unaware of how weather and heat truly interact. And while this convenience feels efficient, it can also create a subtle distance between people and their surroundings, a distance that the medieval cabin bridged with every slow release of stored warmth and every gentle settling of timber. Through these rhythms, the cabin taught its inhabitants that warmth is something earned, preserved, and shared, not something demanded on command from a machine. And this lesson, soft, patient, deeply human, shaped the psychology of communities who relied on cabins not just to survive the winter, but to live well within it, trusting the structure to hold its warmth through the darkest nights and the fiercest storms. As we move even deeper into the quiet architecture of the medieval log cabin, we begin to see that its warmth is not created in isolation, but in a delicate dialogue with the outside world, a constant and graceful balancing act between the bitter cold pressing in from beyond the walls and the slow, steady heat radiating outward from the stone heart within. And this interaction forms a kind of harmony that modern construction often disrupts, rather than respects. When the wind howls across the frozen landscape, slamming into thin-walled modern homes and slipping easily through small gaps and seams, it tests the limits of insulation and mechanical heating, forcing furnaces to cycle on and off with nervous urgency. But in a log cabin, the wind meets something far more formidable: thick walls of dense timber, each log laid with deliberate precision, so that air finds no easy path between them. And this solidity means that even in the fiercest storms, the interior remains still, the air unmoving, the warmth unbroken. Snow, too, becomes part of the system rather than an enemy, drifting gently against the exterior walls until it forms a natural insulating blanket, packing into small crevices and sealing microgaps with its cold silence, and in doing so it becomes an unexpected ally, slowing heat loss even further. A seasonal gift that medieval families welcomed as part of the winter landscape, rather than something to be cleared away at all costs. Cold air, sinking naturally toward the earth, gathers in the spaces beneath the cabin, but the foundation of raised stone piers prevents this cold from seeping upward, allowing the floor thick planks of wood, often doubled and sometimes packed with moss beneath, to remain a stable barrier. Not icy as modern floors often become during outages, but comfortably cool, never sharp or punishing to bare feet, even in the depths of January. The sun, weak though it may be in winter, warms the outer surfaces of the logs during the few bright hours of the day, and because the logs have immense thermal mass, they absorb this faint heat and add it to the reservoir already stored from the masonry heater, contributing to a slow accumulation that continues long after sunset, a layering of warmth that modern homes rarely benefit from because their walls lack the ability to store solar energy in meaningful quantities. Humidity, too, is moderated by the cabin's materials. The logs absorb moisture when the air grows damp and release it again when the air becomes dry, creating a natural balance that modern homes must manage with mechanical humidifiers and dehumidifiers, and this gentle moderation reduces condensation, mold, and discomfort, allowing the air inside the cabin to remain soft and breathable, even in winter when cold air outside grows brittle and dry. All these elements, the wind, the snow, the sun, the cold earth, the shifting humidity, interact with the cabin in a relationship of mutual influence, a partnership rather than a battle, and because the materials were chosen not to resist nature, but to work alongside it, the entire structure behaves like a living system, responding to the environment with quiet intelligence rather than panic or mechanical strain. This harmony is what allows the cabin to feel stable, grounded, and deeply comforting, even as the world outside plunges into violent cold, and it is what gives families inside the sense that the home is not simply sheltering them, but embracing them, holding a steady warmth that is never harsh, never forced, but always present, always patient, always ready to outlast the storm. As we travel further into this gentle investigation, another truth begins to emerge. subtle, steady, and comforting, because the medieval log cabin demonstrates that simplicity, when aligned with the laws of nature, often outperforms complexity. And the more closely we examine these structures, the more we understand that their longevity and warmth were not achieved through elaborate mechanisms, but through an elegant restraint, a refusal to add anything unnecessary, and a deep trust in the materials themselves. Where modern houses rely on layers of synthetic barriers, vapor controls, adhesives, foams, and complex HVAC systems, the medieval cabin achieves the same or greater level of winter comfort with nothing more than logs, stones, moss, clay, and human skill. And this simplicity does not represent primitiveness, but wisdom, a recognition that the most stable systems are often those with the fewest points of failure, the fewest fragile components, and the fewest dependencies that can break when the winter grows harsh. Because in a modern home, a single malfunction, a blown fuse, a seized motor, a frozen pipe can cascade into discomfort or danger within hours. But in a medieval cabin, even a disruption in routine does not immediately threaten the warmth. Since the walls themselves store heat, the masonry heater releases it slowly, and the home's design minimizes the need for constant intervention, creating a resilience that is audible in the silence of the cabin on a winter night, when nothing is running, and yet everything remains warm. This simplicity also makes maintenance intuitive, because to care for such a home, one does not need technical training or specialized tools, only awareness, patience, and a willingness to work with the seasons, checking the moss chinking before winter, clearing the hearth of ash, inspecting the roof for loose shingles, and sweeping the chimney once or twice a year, all of which require effort but are grounded in human rhythm rather than mechanical urgency. Even the act of heating the cabin is simple. Not a constant monitoring of thermostats, vents, and settings, but a short, deliberate fire that charges the stone core for the entire day, freeing the family from the need to tend flames continuously, and restoring the kind of relationship between humans and warmth that feels ancient, steady, and deeply soothing in a way that modern heating rarely replicates. And this simplicity brings with it a quiet emotional comfort, because living in a structure that depends on natural materials rather than machines reduces the background anxiety that many modern homes quietly create, worries about bills, outages, repairs, and failures, and replaces them with a trust in the cabin's ability to hold warmth without constant support, a trust that becomes especially meaningful during the darkest nights of winter when storms rage, or the world outside feels uncertain. In this way, the medieval cabin becomes more than a shelter. It becomes a reminder of how effective the world once was at balancing human needs with the environment, and how sometimes the most advanced solution is not one that adds complexity, but one that removes it, revealing the strength of a system that stands firm not because of technology, but because of logic, experience, and the timeless stability of natural materials arranged with care. This is the quiet superiority of simplicity, a form of engineering that is not loud or flashy, but enduring, calming, efficient, and deeply human. As we drift still further into this quiet understanding of the medieval cabin, another subtle insight begins to settle over the story, an insight that reveals itself gently, like the soft glow of embers in a stone hearth long after the flames have died. Because the builders of these old structures did not design their homes for convenience on a good day, but for survival on the worst day, and this difference in mindset shaped every beam, every log, and every ounce of warmth held within those walls. Modern homes are built on the assumption that electricity will always flow, that fuel will always be available, that machinery will always function as intended, and that winter storms will be mild enough for systems to recover quickly. But medieval cabins were built with a much more realistic and grounded view of nature, one that accepted that storms could last for days, that firewood might be scarce, that someone might fall ill and fail to tend the fire, and that the home itself must continue to protect life even when people could not maintain it. This foresight becomes visible in the way the cabin stores heat, holding it deep within wooden fibers and heavy stone masses, ensuring that even if the fire is neglected or the weather turns suddenly violent, the interior temperature declines so slowly that the family has time to react, to recover, to relight the stove, or simply to wait out the storm without fear of freezing. And this built-in grace period is something most modern homes lack entirely. It also appears in the cabin's compact layout, where rooms are arranged to maximize the reach of radiant heat, with sleeping spaces positioned close to the masonry heater, so that even in emergencies the warmest zones of the home are the ones where people rest, ensuring that the body's core temperature remains safe through the longest nights. And this simple design choice reflects a deep understanding of human needs that does not rely on technology but on thoughtful arrangement. The raised stone foundation anticipates the threat of ground frost, preventing cold from seeping upward into the living space. The thick roofs anticipate heavy snowfall, supporting the silent weight of winter without strain. And the chinking materials anticipate movement, shifting with the logs as they settle, ensuring airtightness even decades later, when modern sealants would have long since cracked or crumbled. The cabin anticipates scarcity too, scarcity of fuel, of time, of health, because it is built to hold warmth long enough that missing a fire cycle is not dangerous, but merely a mild inconvenience. And this resilience, this ability to remain safe even during hardship, is a direct result of the builder's awareness that winter can be unforgiving, storms unpredictable, and life imperfect. In this way, the medieval cabin embodies a form of practical wisdom that modern construction often overlooks: the recognition that buildings must not only perform during ideal conditions, but must endure through the inevitable moments when things go wrong, when systems fail, when people falter, and when the environment asserts itself with its full ancient force. And so the cabin, far from being a primitive shelter, becomes a carefully designed machine for survival, one that works without electricity, without motors, without pipelines, and without fragile technologies, relying instead on the steady logic of thermal mass, airtight joinery, radiant heat, and spatial intention, all principles that remain valid, powerful, and deeply relevant even in our modern world. This is the beauty of a home built for the worst day. Its reliability becomes a quiet comfort on every day, its resilience becomes a kind of peace, and its ability to hold warmth through the darkness becomes a gentle reminder that the simplest designs are often the ones that truly protect us. As we continue following the quiet thread of this story, we begin to see that the medieval log cabin did more than keep families alive through the winter. It shaped the very culture of the people who lived inside it, influencing how they gathered, how they shared stories, how they worked, rested, and related to one another. Because when warmth is precious and held with care, the rhythms of human life bend gently toward that center, forming a social world built around the soft glow of stored heat. In modern homes where every room can be heated independently at the touch of a thermostat, families often spread out through the house, each person in a different corner, isolated by screens or routines. But in a medieval cabin, the warmest part of the home, the region near the masonry heater, became the natural gathering place, and entire evenings were spent together in that small circle of radiant comfort, with parents mending clothing or preparing food, while children played quietly on the warm bench built into the side of the stove. Stories were told there, not loud or theatrical, but soft and steady, the kind of storytelling that comes from the slow drift of a winter night, and the gentle backdrop of heat radiating through stone. And these shared moments, repeated through season after season, formed the bonds that knit families and communities together, creating traditions and memories that lasted long after the snow had melted and the logs had cooled. Visitors too were welcomed into this circle of warmth, removing their heavy winter coats and sitting close to the heater while snow melted from their boots. And the simple act of offering warmth became an expression of hospitality, a gesture that spoke more deeply than food or gifts, because in winter climates, warmth is comfort, safety, and friendship all at once. and sharing it is a way of saying you are safe here inside our walls, away from the storm. In the early mornings, the first person awake would tend the brief, intense fire that recharged the heater, and the faint sound of kindling catching flame would signal the beginning of a new day. A sound that for children meant breakfast was coming, and for elders meant that the heart of the home was beating again, pushing warmth into the logs that would hold it through the coming hours. During long storms, when travel was impossible and the world outside vanished in a curtain of white, families would turn inward, gathering around the heater not only for warmth but for company. And these days, quiet, slow, insulated from the rush of life, became moments of shared reflection, where time seemed to stretch in a soft, steady arc, and the pressures of survival softened into togetherness. Even the cabin's structure encouraged cooperation, stacking firewood before winter required teamwork. Maintaining the moss chinking was a group task, cleaning the chimney was a ritual of preparation for the season ahead, and in completing these tasks together, families reinforced the understanding that warmth was a shared responsibility, and that the cabin's ability to protect them depended on their willingness to care for it. Over time, these practices formed a culture built on mutual support, foresight, and gratitude for warmth, virtues that emerged not from ideology, but from architecture itself, from the way the cabin's design guided the daily movements and interactions of its inhabitants, teaching them through lived experience that survival and comfort were collective achievements. And so, the medieval cabin did not merely host culture, it created it, shaping the emotional and social landscape of winter life in ways that modern homes, with their separation, their mechanical noise, and their fleeting warmth, rarely replicate, reminding us that the spaces we inhabit shape the people we become. As we drift further into the sensory world of the medieval log cabin, another dimension reveals itself, one that modern architecture often overlooks, and that is the quiet music of the space, the gentle acoustic warmth created by thick timber, stone, and natural fibers, because the way a home holds sound is just as important to our sense of comfort as the way it holds heat, and in these ancient structures the two were inseparable, blending into a single atmosphere that wrapped the occupants in a feeling of deep, instinctive safety. In a modern home, the constant hum of technology, the furnace cycling, the refrigerator buzzing, the vents blowing, the pipes expanding, creates a subtle but persistent layer of noise, a mechanical heartbeat that never quite rests. And while we often learn to ignore it, the nervous system does not, responding to each shift in sound with a tiny flicker of awareness that keeps the body just slightly more alert than it needs to be. But in a medieval cabin, the soundscape was shaped entirely by natural materials, the soft creaking of logs settling with the temperature, the faint rustle of wind pressing gently against the outer walls, the almost imperceptible pulse of radiant heat rising from the masonry heater, and the quiet, steady breathing of the people inside, all blending into a kind of living silence that encouraged the mind to sink deeper into rest. Thick wooden walls absorbed sharp noises before they could echo, smoothing every sound into something soft, rounded, and warm. And this acoustic gentleness helped families sleep through long winter nights without interruption, letting the mind drift into that peaceful state where the absence of threat is felt, not consciously but physically, in the slowing of breath and the loosening of muscles. Even the way the logs muffled the storm outside contributed to this sense of sanctuary, because when the wind roared across frozen fields or shook the crowns of tall pines, the cabin transformed that violence into a distant whisper, a muted reminder that the world beyond the walls was fierce but could not harm those inside, and this contrast between the wild cold and the calm interior deepened the emotional meaning of warmth, making it not just a physical condition but a kind of psychological shield. The masonry heater added its own quiet signature to the soundscape. The faint ticking of expanding stone as the fire's heat seeped inward, the gentle settling of ash after the flames had died, and the low resonance of captured warmth radiating outward hour after hour, not in noise but in a tactile hush that the skin could feel more than the ears could hear, a kind of acoustic softness that made the cabin feel alive without ever becoming loud. Conversations inside the cabin naturally fell into the rhythm of this environment, spoken in hushed tones that matched the surrounding stillness, because when a home's acoustics are gentle, voices instinctively soften, and in that softening families found space for reflection, storytelling, quiet companionship, and moments of shared peace that became part of the cabin's emotional fabric. Even solitude felt different in such a space. Sitting alone by the warmth of the stone, one could hear the small sounds of the house breathing around them, the logs shifting slightly with the temperature, the wind humming faintly at the eaves, and this understated symphony offered comfort rather than isolation, making the cabin feel inhabited even in silence, a reminder that warmth is not just about temperature, but about the presence of life within the walls. This acoustic warmth, woven together with the thermal warmth and the cultural warmth, created an environment uniquely suited to deep rest, emotional grounding, and intimate family life, qualities that modern homes, for all their conveniences, struggle to reproduce. As we wander deeper into the world of the medieval log cabin, another layer of its quiet wisdom becomes clear: the way the home itself transformed with the seasons, shifting its behavior in response to sunlight, moisture, temperature, and wind, creating a long, slow dance between structure and environment that allowed families to live in remarkable comfort, despite the harshness of northern climates, because this cabin was not static but alive in its own steady rhythm. In winter, the cabin functioned as a keeper of heat, drawing in the warmth of a short fire and holding it tightly within its mass, creating an interior climate that remained steady through the coldest nights. But when spring arrived and the world began to thaw, the logs responded subtly to the rising humidity, absorbing moisture just enough to swell slightly, tightening the joints without damaging the structure, and in doing so renewing the cabin's air tightness after the dryness of winter. As summer took hold and the air grew warm, the thick logs protected the interior from heat, just as they protected it from cold, slowing the entrance of warmth with the same patience that slowed the escape of it in winter, creating a cool refuge even during the longest days, because the thermal mass that held heat in January now resisted it in July, making the cabin a naturally temperate shelter throughout the year. The moss chinking, too, shifted with the seasons, expanding during humid periods to seal tiny gaps, then relaxing slightly during dry months, maintaining a breathable but protective barrier that modern materials struggle to replicate. And this seasonal elasticity meant that the home always adapted itself in ways that required no machines, no systems, no human intervention, only time and the natural intelligence of the materials themselves. The stone of the masonry heater also participated in this seasonal cycle, because although its primary role was to store winter heat, the mass of stone acted as a stabilizer even in warmer months, smoothing temperature swings and maintaining a gentle coolness when the outside world became too warm, offering a resting place that felt grounded, steady, and deeply connected to the earth. Even the scent of the cabin changed with the seasons. In winter it carried the faint aroma of warm wood and drying herbs. In spring it held the smell of thawing moss and fresh air slipping through newly opened shutters. In summer it carried the earthy scent of logs shaded from the sun, and in autumn it began to cool again, smelling faintly of bark, iron tools, and the first fire of the season burning gently in the stove. These sensory shifts helped families remain deeply attuned to the turning of the year, because the cabin was not a climate-sealed box but a participant in the environment, offering cues through its temperature, its scent, its sound, and the feel of the air on bare skin. And this connection fostered a kind of seasonal awareness that modern homes rarely encourage, grounding people in the natural world, even as they remained sheltered from its harsher elements. The cabin's performance across seasons also meant that families never felt disconnected from the passage of time. The home reminded them when winter approached, when firewood needed preparing, when moss should be inspected, when the heater needed its annual cleaning, and these recurring tasks, aligned with the seasons, created rituals of care that deepened the relationship between the family and its shelter. In this way, the medieval cabin was not simply a building frozen in time, but a dynamic partner in the yearly cycle of life, adjusting itself with each shift in climate and guiding its inhabitants through the seasons with a gentle, dependable presence that felt as natural as the changing light itself. As our quiet exploration deepens, we begin to see that the medieval log cabin, in its simplicity and resilience, contains a kind of environmental wisdom that modern conversations about sustainability often overlook, because long before carbon footprints were measured or energy audits existed, these homes were built from materials that grew under cold skies, shaped by hand, and arranged in ways that created comfort without waste, demonstrating that true sustainability is not a formula or a certification, but the natural result of working with the earth instead of against it. Every element of the cabin was locally sourced, born from the same landscapes that the people themselves inhabited. The dense pine and spruce trees grew slowly in the surrounding forests, absorbing nutrients from the soil and responding to the same seasonal rhythms that shaped the lives of the builders. The stones used in the hearth were gathered from riverbeds and hillsides, warmed by sunlight in summer and carved by frost in winter, and the moss used for chinking was collected from nearby wetlands, forming a cycle of use and renewal that required no distant factories or complex supply chains. This deep connection between material and place meant that each cabin carried within its walls a history of the land, a physical memory of the climate it was built to endure. And because these materials were biodegradable, renewable, and low in embodied energy, the cabin's environmental footprint was not merely small, it was harmonious, blending into the cycle of life in a way that felt almost effortless. The energy used to heat the cabin was equally sustainable, because a masonry heater burns wood intensely but efficiently, extracting almost all of the heat from a small amount of fuel and releasing minimal smoke, and the wood itself was often gathered from deadfall, old branches or managed forests, creating a closed-loop system where energy came from the land and returned to it in the form of ash that enriched the soil. Even the cabin's longevity was a form of sustainability, because a home that lasts 200 years without requiring major replacements or complex repairs consumes far fewer resources than one that must be rebuilt, remodeled, or mechanically upgraded every few decades. And the fact that many medieval cabins still stand today, warm, tight, and functional, shows that durability is one of the most important yet overlooked aspects of ecological design. Furthermore, the cabin's ability to remain warm during outages meant that families were not dependent on external energy systems to survive winter, reducing pressure on local infrastructure and creating communities that were more self-sufficient, more resilient, and less vulnerable to interruptions in supply. And this independence was itself a form of sustainability, rooted not in technology but in the relationship between material, structure, and climate. The cabin's breathable walls allowed moisture to escape naturally, preventing mold and rot without the need for chemical treatments or powered ventilation. And this passive regulation of humidity created a healthier indoor environment, demonstrating that sustainable design should prioritize not only the planet's health, but the health of the people living inside the home. In these ways, the medieval log cabin becomes a quiet teacher, reminding us that sustainability is not achieved through complex technologies alone, but through the thoughtful alignment of human needs with the rhythms of nature, and that when materials are chosen wisely, arranged with intention, and allowed to age gracefully, a home can become a long-lasting companion rather than a temporary product. It teaches us that true ecological harmony does not require sacrifice or discomfort, only patience, observation, and respect for the forces that shape our world. As we continue this gentle journey through the deeper workings of the medieval log cabin, it becomes clear that its remarkable warmth is not just the sum of dense logs and a glowing stone hearth, but the result of a subtle choreography of heat, a quiet and invisible dance where conduction, convection, and radiation all play their part in a slow-moving symphony that sustains comfort through even the most unforgiving winter nights. Heat begins its journey in the firebox of the masonry heater, where a small but intense burst of flame releases energy quickly, raising the temperature of the stone core to high levels in a short span of time. And as this heat pulses outward, it is absorbed deeply into the thick masonry, each brick and stone taking in warmth the way a sponge absorbs water, holding it tightly until the fire fades. Once stored, this heat moves outward primarily through radiation, the most restful and human-friendly form of warmth, because radiant heat does not rely on blowing air or turbulent circulation, but travels gently through space, warming bodies, objects, and surfaces directly, settling into room corners, penetrating thick clothing, and creating a sense of enveloping comfort that feels both ancient and profoundly soothing. The logs themselves participate in this radiant cycle, absorbing warmth from the heater during the day and releasing it slowly throughout the night, their dense fibers holding on to energy long after the air has cooled, creating an interior environment where the temperature remains remarkably stable, avoiding the harsh swings that define modern heating systems, and replacing them with a soft continuity that lulls the body toward rest. Meanwhile, convection, the movement of warm air, plays only a minor but important role, drifting gently upward from the heater and pooling softly near the ceiling. But because the ceilings are low, the warm air remains within reach of the occupants instead of escaping into high, unused space, ensuring that the warmth stays close to the people who depend on it. Conduction, the slow transfer of heat through solid materials, works quietly in the background. Warmth moves from the heated stone into the wooden floorboards beneath it, into the benches that line the heater's sides, and into the logs themselves, creating layers of comfort that radiate back into the room hours later, long after the fire has died, and this stored heat becomes a kind of thermal echo, repeating the memory of the morning fire late into the evening. Even the chinking contributes to this process. The moss and clay mixture, with its natural air pockets, slows the escape of warmth without trapping moisture, allowing the walls to remain breathable while still holding heat with surprising efficiency, a performance that modern synthetic insulation often struggles to match without complicated ventilation systems. Outside the cabin, the thick blanket of snow pressed gently against the walls adds another subtle layer of insulation, slowing the loss of heat even further, and forming part of the natural thermal envelope that the cabin relies on during the darkest months. And this collaboration between the cabin and its environment forms a kind of seasonal pact where nature itself helps sustain the warmth inside. All of these forces, radiation, conduction, convection, mass, moisture balance, and environmental partnership, intertwine to create a system that moves heat in the most efficient way possible without requiring constant input, constant noise, or constant attention, revealing that the cabin is not heated by fire alone but by a whole ecosystem of slow, quiet processes working together. It is this slow movement of heat, gentle and predictable, that makes the interior feel alive and deeply comforting, creating an environment where warmth does not come in gusts or surges, but in soft, continuous waves that encourage the mind to rest and the body to settle deeply into sleep. As we drift further along this quiet path, we find ourselves approaching a moment that reveals more about the medieval cabin than any calm winter night could ever show. The moment when the full force of a northern storm descends upon the land, when the sky turns heavy and grey, the wind arrives in long icy sheets, and snow falls not in delicate flakes, but in sweeping, blinding waves that erase the horizon and turn the world into a white, swirling silence. It is in these moments, when nature gathers its strength and unleashes the deep cold of the northern winter, that the cabin's design shows its true purpose. Because while modern homes shudder under the pressure of storm winds, their mechanical systems straining as temperatures plunge, the log cabin stands firm, its thick timber walls absorbing the impact with quiet confidence, the rounded surfaces of the logs shedding snow and deflecting gusts the way a ship's hull parts waves in a rough sea. Inside, the masonry heater continues to radiate the stored warmth of the morning fire, its stone heart glowing with a soft, steady pulse that requires no fuel, no fan, no electricity, allowing families to gather near it, listening to the distant roar of the storm as a muffled echo rather than a direct threat, and feeling the profound relief that comes from knowing their home is stronger than the weather outside. As the wind pushes against the walls, the cabin responds not with rattles or drafts, but with the subtle flexing of wood, each log settling slightly into its neighbor, tightening the joinery and sealing out the cold even more effectively than before, because wood, unlike steel or synthetic materials, has a natural elasticity that allows it to shift and adapt under pressure, transforming the fiercest gusts into nothing more than a faint tremor felt deep within the structure. Snow begins to pack itself around the exterior, filling tiny gaps and adding an insulating layer several inches thick, and rather than seeing this as a burden, the cabin welcomes it, allowing the snow to act as a temporary shield that slows the loss of heat even further, creating a cocoon around the home that enhances its already impressive thermal stability. The roof, built with a steep pitch or heavy beams depending on regional traditions, shoulders the accumulating snow with steady patience, distributing the weight through massive timbers that have supported hundreds of winters before this one, and as the snow builds, it adds yet another insulating cap, trapping warmth beneath it and helping the interior remain even more comfortable as the storm rages on. Inside, children might press their ears to the wooden walls, listening to the distant hum of wind that no longer has the power to chill them, while elders sit near the heater, comforted by the knowledge that even if the storm lasts all night or several nights, the cabin will hold its warmth with the same quiet certainty it has held it for generations before. Food stored in cool but not freezing corners of the cabin remains safe. Water does not turn to ice and the air stays soft and breathable, never turning sharp or dangerous the way it can in modern homes when heat systems fail, because the cabin's warmth does not depend on external conditions but on internal mass, stored energy, and the deep equilibrium of its materials. Even after hours of storm, the temperature inside falls only gently, a degree or two at a time, giving the family time to rest, to wait, to breathe easily, and to trust in the structure that surrounds them, trust earned over centuries of storms just like this one. Storms survived because the cabin was not built for beauty alone, but for the unglamorous but essential duty of safeguarding human life. In these hours, when the world outside is a swirling chaos of snow and wind, the cabin becomes a sanctuary in the truest sense, reminding us that resilience is not loud or mechanical but steady, patient, and deeply rooted in the timeless logic of materials that know how to hold heat. As the storm outside thickens into the deep hours of the night and the world beyond the cabin walls becomes a white, whirling void, the home itself takes on a role that feels almost animate, a silent guardian that keeps its family warm as they sleep, holding the memory of fire within its logs and stone, maintaining a gentle equilibrium that protects life in a way modern structures rarely achieve without the constant hum of machinery. Inside the sleeping room, the air remains still and soft, untouched by drafts or temperature swings, because the thick log walls absorb not only heat but sound and movement, creating an environment so stable that the rise and fall of the storm outside becomes nothing more than a distant murmur, a faint, soothing reminder that the cabin is doing exactly what it was built to do, keep the cold at bay. The masonry heater, though long extinguished, continues to breathe out slow waves of warmth, each pulse barely perceptible but deeply comforting, warming the wooden floorboards beneath sleeping feet, the wool blankets that drape over resting bodies, and the very air that drifts gently between the logs, creating a cradle of thermal calm that seems to hold time itself in suspension. The logs, warmed earlier in the day, release their stored heat with quiet patience, their dense fibers radiating a low, steady warmth that keeps frost from creeping into corners and prevents the room from cooling too quickly. And this slow, controlled release of energy, ensures that even the coldest nights feel safe rather than threatening, the cabin acting as a buffer between the fragile bodies inside and the unforgiving world outside. In the cradle of this warmth, sleep becomes deeper, heavier, more restorative, because the body senses stability, no sudden drops in temperature, no bursts of cold air, no mechanical noise interrupting the silence, and the nervous system relaxes into a state of complete rest, trusting the environment in a way it rarely can in modern homes where the air cycles on and off with abrupt, artificial shifts. Even the wooden joints of the cabin seem to participate in the night watch, settling with occasional soft creaks as the temperature adjusts, not as warning sounds but as the natural speech of a living structure adjusting itself through the dark hours, its movements subtle, organic, and utterly predictable, offering reassurance rather than alarm. For children sleeping near the warm alcoves built into the masonry heater, the night feels like a gentle embrace, soft warmth at their backs, thick blankets pulled to their chins, and the knowledge, even if unspoken, that the home around them is strong enough to face the winter alone, giving them permission to drift into dreams where cold is nothing more than a distant echo. For the elders, whose bones feel the winter more keenly, the steady, radiant heat provides relief that no forced air furnace can imitate, penetrating deep into joints and muscles, easing tension, and making long nights not only bearable but comfortable, even healing, as warmth soaks into the body like a quiet balm. The hearthstones, though cool to the touch by midnight, retain enough memory of the morning fire to create warm pockets in the air, pockets where breath remains soft and faces remain relaxed, and the interplay between stone and wood maintains a temperature far more stable than modern heating systems that rely on continuous input rather than captured energy. Even after many hours pass, the cabin loses warmth only in slow increments, 1 degree, then another, not enough to wake the sleepers or disturb their peace, and each tiny change is offset by the steady release of heat from walls, floors, and stone, creating a delicate balance that holds firm until dawn, when the cycle begins again with a short fire that restores the warmth for the coming day. And so the cabin stands through the winter night, like a sentinel, steady and silent, its thermal mass acting as both armor and heartbeat, its walls sheltering fragile life from the frozen world outside. And in this quiet guardianship, we find the essence of what makes these structures extraordinary, not their age or aesthetic, but their unwavering ability to protect warmth when it is needed most. When the storm finally loosens its grip on the world and the first faint light of dawn spreads quietly across the snow, the medieval cabin begins a subtle transformation, reawakening from its night-long vigil, with the same patience and grace that carried it through the darkness, because even as the skies brighten and the cold air settles into a softer stillness, the home continues its steady work of holding warmth and guiding the day's first movements. Outside, the world is hushed beneath a heavy quilt of snow, each drift reflecting the pale morning light in soft shades of blue and silver, and the cabin sits half buried in this frozen landscape, its roof thick with white, its logs darkened by moisture, its shape blending almost naturally into the muted tones of the forest. But inside, the air remains calm and gentle, carrying the last remnants of the heat stored from the day before. The sleepers begin to stir, not jolted awake by sudden cold or the sharp blast of a furnace switching on, but slowly, comfortably, guided by the faint glow of dawn filtering through small frost-framed windows and the lingering warmth that has softened the night air into a cocoon of comfort. And this gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness is one of the quiet gifts the cabin gives, an unhurried shift that allows the mind and body to rise together without strain. The first person awake steps softly across the wooden floor, feeling the boards still holding a trace of warmth in their grain, and moves toward the masonry heater, touching its surface with a practiced hand to gauge how deeply the heat has settled into the stone. The warmth is fading but present, a slow exhale that has not yet ended, and this reassuring pulse of residual heat makes the morning feel safe, manageable, and grounded. Preparing the fire for the new day becomes a peaceful ritual, performed not out of urgency but out of continuity. Gathering a few pieces of wood, arranging them carefully in the firebox, striking a spark that catches quickly because the firebox is dry and the draft is steady, and as the flames rise in bright, lively bursts, they bring with them the promise of another day's warmth, another cycle of heat that will carry the cabin and its family through the hours ahead. As the fire begins its brief but intense burn, the cold edges in the room retreat even further, replaced by the early glow of radiant heat spreading gently across the space, warming the wooden walls in slow waves, softening the chill that clings to blankets, and giving the morning air a sense of familiarity, as if the cabin were greeting its inhabitants with a warm hand on the shoulder. Meanwhile, the logs, full of memory from the previous day, continue their own slow release of heat, blending with the new warmth from the stove until the interior feels balanced again, neither too hot nor too cold, but perfectly tempered, allowing everyone inside to begin their morning routines without haste or discomfort, the cabin adjusting around them like a living thing that understands the rhythm of the day. Outside, the storm's remnants still cling to the world, but the family inside feels none of its sting. The cabin has shielded them not only from the cold but from the anxiety that often follows winter storms, offering instead a sense of continuity, stability, and calm that sets the tone for the entire day. As breakfast is prepared and the home fills with the scent of warm food mixing with the last wisps of wood smoke, the cabin stands quietly in the morning light, its structure warmed again, its purpose renewed, and its place in the cycle of life reaffirmed, showing once more that its strength lies not only in resisting winter's harshness, but in welcoming each new day with the same quiet resilience that has defined it for generations. And as our long journey through the quiet world of the medieval log cabin comes gently to its close, we begin to understand that the true power of these ancient homes lies not only in their craftsmanship, nor solely in their remarkable ability to stay warm through the deepest cold, but in the wisdom they carry, wisdom about resilience, about patience, about the profound comfort that comes from working with nature rather than trying to conquer it. For centuries, these cabins endured storms, sheltered families, and offered warmth in places where winter could be deadly, yet they accomplished all of this without electricity, without machines, and without any of the technologies we now consider essential, showing that human beings once built with a different kind of intelligence, an intelligence rooted in observation, intuition, and a respect for the slow, steady laws that govern the natural world. They show us that warmth does not need to be constant to be reliable, that a home can remain safe even when the fire sleeps and the world turns cold, and that the materials best suited to protect us are often the ones that have grown from the earth itself. Wood dense enough to hold the memory of sunlight, stone patient enough to release heat long after the flames die, moss flexible enough to seal gaps through generations. They teach us that comfort is not just a matter of temperature but of stability, of silence, of the gentle continuity that comes from a home that warms slowly, cools slowly, and never demands attention with sudden noises or mechanical cycles, instead offering a kind of peace that seeps quietly into the rhythm of daily life. They remind us that a truly resilient home is not the one that works perfectly when everything is functioning, but the one that continues to protect us when things go wrong, the one that holds its warmth even during outages, illness, storms, or long winter nights, when the fire cannot be tended. And they whisper, in their old wooden voices, that sustainability is not a new invention but an old memory, a way of building that grew from the land, returned to the land, and stood for generations because it understood the seasons as partners rather than enemies, and used materials in ways that honored their natural strengths. Most of all, they show us that there is deep value in slowness, in walls that age like living things, in heaters that warm stone by stone, in nights that remain safe because the home itself is storing the day's light inside its bones. and in mornings that begin gently because the house kept its promise through the dark. And so, this story ends where it began, with a cabin on a frozen night, holding its warmth in silence while the world outside turns white and wild, proving that the knowledge of the past was never primitive but profoundly human, that the builders who shaped these homes were not merely surviving but understanding, and that their wisdom still has the power to guide us today. For the warmth they built was more than heat. It was resilience. It was harmony. It was a quiet partnership between people, wood, stone, and winter. A warmth that outlives time.